I knew I had already lost when my own family started laughing before I finished speaking. My name is Margaret Dawson, and at 71 years old, I never imagined I would become the punchline at a family meeting. Yet that is exactly what happened. Looking back now, I understand something I did not understand then. People do not always believe the truth. Sometimes they believe the person who tells the better story. The family meeting took place on a Sunday afternoon at my son Eric's house, just outside Denver. It was supposed to be a simple discussion about my late brother's estate. Several relatives had gathered in the living room. Coffee cups sat on side tables. Family photographs lined the walls. The atmosphere felt casual and comfortable at first. Rachel moved through the room, greeting everyone with her usual effortless charm. My daughter-in-law had a gift for making people feel seen. She remembered birthdays. She asked thoughtful questions. She volunteered for community projects. If you met her for the first time, you would probably trust her immediately. Most people did. I once did too. We all settled into our seats shortly after 2 o'clock. My niece reviewed paperwork. My cousins discussed timelines. The conversation moved naturally from one topic to another. Then someone mentioned a missing financial record connected to the estate. The moment I heard the description, something felt wrong. Over the past several months, I had noticed inconsistencies involving certain documents. Nothing dramatic, just details that never quite matched, dates that seemed off, statements that contradicted earlier conversations. I had tried to ignore those concerns because I wanted peace. But sitting there that afternoon, listening to everyone discuss the situation, I realized I could not remain silent. Actually, I said carefully, there is something I think everyone should look at more closely. The room became quiet. For a brief moment, I thought people were genuinely interested. Then Rachel smiled. Not a cruel smile. Not an angry one. A patient smile. The kind someone gives when humoring a confused relative. Margaret, she said gently, I think we have already reviewed that. A few relatives nodded. I felt heat rise into my face. No, I replied. This is different. Rachel exchanged a glance with Eric. The look lasted only a second, but I noticed it. Then one of my cousins chuckled softly. Here we go, he said. Laughter rippled through part of the room. Not loud, not vicious, just enough to sting. I remained seated. I am serious. Rachel placed a reassuring hand on Eric's arm. She has been worried about this for weeks. More smiles appeared. More sympathetic looks. Suddenly I realized something unsettling. People were not listening to what I was saying. They were reacting to who they thought I was. The concerned older woman. The anxious widow. The family member who worried too much. My words barely mattered anymore. One relative leaned back in his chair and laughed. What is the conspiracy this time? Several people smiled. Someone else shook their head. I looked around the room searching for a single face that seemed uncertain. Most people appeared amused. Others looked embarrassed for me. Nobody appeared curious. Nobody wanted evidence. They had already reached a conclusion before I opened my mouth. Rachel remained calm throughout all of it. That was what made it so effective. She never insulted me. She never raised her voice. She simply sat there looking reasonable while everyone else dismissed my concerns for her. Finally, I stopped talking. The discussion moved on without me. Papers were shuffled. New topics emerged. Conversations resumed. Yet as I sat quietly in the corner of that room, one thought refused to leave my mind. If everyone was so certain I was wrong, why was Rachel watching me so carefully? The moment the meeting ended, people returned to normal conversation as though nothing unusual had happened. Coffee was refilled. Chairs scraped across the hardwood floor. Someone turned on a football game in the next room. Laughter drifted through the house. Yet I remained seated for several minutes, staring at the stack of estate documents resting on the coffee table. The concern I had tried to raise was already forgotten, at least by everyone else. As relatives began gathering coats and purses, I quietly watched the room. Years of experience had taught me that people reveal more after they think a conversation is over. Rachel moved comfortably from group to group, smiling and chatting. Several relatives thanked her for helping keep everything organized. Others praised her patience. One aunt even joked that the family would fall apart without her. Rachel laughed modestly and waved away the compliments. The performance was flawless. If I had been seeing her for the first time, I probably would have admired her too. On my way out, I overheard part of a conversation near the front door. One cousin lowered his voice and said, I feel bad for Margaret. She has been getting confused lately. The other nodded sympathetically. Rachel handles it better than I could. I kept walking. Neither of them realized I had heard a word. The drive home felt longer than usual. Denver's late afternoon traffic crawled along while I replayed the meeting in my mind. Not the laughter, not even the jokes. What bothered me most was how quickly everyone dismissed the possibility that I might be right. Nobody asked what I had found. Nobody wanted to see the information. They simply trusted Rachel's version of events before hearing mine. When I arrived home, I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and made a cup of tea. The house felt unusually quiet. My husband had been gone for nearly 8 years, but some evenings his absence felt heavier than others. This was one of them. He had always been the person who listened all the way through before making up his mind. Around 7 o'clock, my phone rang. It was my granddaughter Olivia. Her voice sounded hesitant. "Grandma, are you okay?" I smiled despite myself. Why wouldn't I be? There was a brief pause. Because of what happened today. I lowered myself into a chair. "You noticed that?" Olivia sighed. Everybody noticed it. For the first time all day, someone sounded honest. We talked for several minutes. Mostly about ordinary things. School, work, weekend plans. Then her tone changed. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What were you trying to tell everyone?" I stared out the kitchen window at the fading sunlight. "I found something that did not make sense." "In the estate paperwork?" "Yes." Olivia hesitated. "Then why didn't you show them?" The question caught me off guard. I thought about it for a moment. Because nobody wanted to see it. Silence followed. Then Olivia said something that immediately got my attention. "I'm not sure that is true." My grip tightened slightly around the phone. "What do you mean?" Another pause. When everyone started laughing, I looked at Rachel. The room suddenly felt very still. And Olivia lowered her voice. She was smiling at everyone else. But when she looked at you, she seemed nervous. Olivia's observation stayed with me long after our phone call ended. I sat alone in my kitchen listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator while darkness settled outside the windows. Rachel had seemed nervous. The words repeated in my mind again and again. It would have been easy to dismiss them. Olivia was 19. She might have misread the situation. Yet something deep inside me recognized the possibility immediately. Because if Rachel truly believed I was wrong, there would have been no reason for nervousness at all. The following morning, I pulled the estate documents from my desk drawer and spread them across the dining room table. For weeks, I had been reviewing them in small pieces. This time, I started from the beginning. Page by page, date by date, signature by signature. The problem was not obvious. In fact, that was what made it so frustrating. Everything appeared normal until you looked closely. Around noon, I received a text message from Eric. It was short. "Hope you're not still upset about yesterday." Rachel was only trying to keep the meeting productive. I stared at the message for several seconds before setting my phone down. The wording felt familiar. Not because Eric had written it before, because I had heard variations of it for years. Rachel was helping. Rachel was organizing. Rachel was protecting everyone from unnecessary stress. Somehow, every disagreement eventually became proof of Rachel's good intentions. I spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through old files stored in a cabinet beside my desk. Estate records, property, tax statements, correspondence, meeting notes. My late brother had always been meticulous about paperwork. He believed records mattered because memories could be unreliable. At the time, I thought it was simply a personality trait. Now it felt like a gift. As the hours passed, I found myself thinking less about the meeting and more about the years leading up to it. Rachel had not become everyone's favorite overnight. She built that position carefully. Family dinners, holiday gatherings, community events. Every interaction added another layer. She remembered names, sent thank you cards, volunteered for difficult tasks. She became the person everyone trusted. Looking back, I realized something else. Whenever disagreements occurred, Rachel rarely argued. Instead, she framed herself as the reasonable person trying to keep peace. Anyone who questioned her automatically appeared difficult by comparison, including me. Late that evening, Olivia stopped by unexpectedly. She carried a notebook and looked unusually serious. Without saying much, she sat across from me and began flipping through several pages of handwritten notes. "I started making a timeline," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "A timeline?" She nodded. "Of everything Rachel told people versus what actually happened." My interest immediately grew. Olivia pointed to several entries. Community events, family decisions, financial discussions. One by one, she had listed statements Rachel made over the years and compared them against actual dates. Most of the differences were small, barely noticeable, yet together they formed a pattern. I studied the notes in silence. Then my eyes stopped on a single entry near the center of the page. It involved the exact estate document I had tried to discuss during the family meeting. According to Rachel's explanation, one financial transfer occurred months after a specific account had been closed. I blinked. Then I checked the paperwork again. Olivia was right. The dates did not match. It was a tiny detail, so small that nobody would notice unless they deliberately compared the records. Slowly, I looked up from the papers. Olivia was already watching me. "Grandma," she said, quietly, "what if that is why Rachel looked nervous?" I looked down at the documents spread across my dining room table and felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. Relief because I was no longer imagining things. Unease because Olivia's question made too much sense. If Rachel had noticed the same discrepancy, then her nervous expression during the meeting suddenly had a very different meaning. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily while evening shadows stretched across the room. Finally, Olivia reached for one of the papers and pointed to the date again. This transfer could not have happened the way she described it. I nodded slowly. The account closure date was clearly documented. The timeline simply did not work. Yet what fascinated me was not the error itself. It was how nobody else had noticed it. Then again, nobody had looked. They trusted Rachel. They trusted her explanations. Most people stop asking questions once they decide who the trustworthy person is. The following morning, I called my nephew Andrew. He had worked with my late brother on several financial matters over the years and possessed copies of records I no longer had. At first, our conversation was casual. Then I mentioned the discrepancy. Silence followed. Not the confused kind. The thoughtful kind. "That is interesting," Andrew finally said. "I remember something odd about those documents." My pulse quickened slightly. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. "I would need to check my files." We agreed to meet later that week. After hanging up, I sat by the window watching sunlight move across my backyard. For the first time since the family meeting, I felt something approaching certainty. The problem was no longer based on intuition. It was based on records, facts, timelines, things that could be verified. 3 days later, Andrew arrived carrying a slim folder. We sat at the kitchen table while Olivia joined us after classes. One by one, Andrew removed copies of correspondence, transaction summaries, and estate planning notes. Most of it confirmed what we already knew. Then he found a document neither Olivia nor I had seen before. It was a memorandum attached to one of the account reviews conducted shortly before my brother passed away. The note itself seemed insignificant, just a few sentences. Yet one sentence immediately caught my attention. It referenced a discussion that supposedly occurred several weeks after a particular account had already been closed. Andrew frowned. That should not be there. Olivia leaned closer. Why? He pointed at the dates. Because the account no longer existed. The room became very quiet. We reviewed the timeline again. Then again. Each time, the same conclusion emerged. The explanation presented at the family meeting depended on events occurring after key records had already been finalized. It was not a matter of interpretation. The dates simply did not fit. I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt sad. Because the more evidence appeared, the harder it became to dismiss what it implied. This was no longer about a misunderstanding. Someone had either ignored the facts or hoped nobody else would notice them. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a text message from Eric. "Mom, Rachel wants to know why you have been asking people questions about the estate." I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then another message arrived. "She thinks you are making things more complicated than they need to be." I slowly set the phone down. Across the table, Olivia watched my expression change. "What is it?" she asked. I handed her the phone. She read the message and shook her head. "That sounds like someone who is worried." I looked toward the stack of documents resting between us. More pieces were appearing. More timelines were aligning. And for the first time, I began to suspect that Rachel knew exactly how dangerous those documents could become if anyone ever decided to read them carefully. Over the next several days, I stopped trying to convince myself that the situation was a misunderstanding. The documents on my dining room table had become impossible to ignore. Every timeline we checked pointed in the same direction. Every record raised the same question. Why had Rachel been so determined to steer people away from looking closely? Olivia continued, helping me organize everything into chronological order. Account closures, property transfers, meeting notes, correspondence. At first glance, none of it seemed dramatic. In fact, that was what made the situation so dangerous. The truth was buried beneath ordinary paperwork. Most people would never notice the inconsistencies unless they deliberately compared one document against another. One afternoon, Olivia arrived carrying a small cardboard box she had borrowed from her father's storage room. "I think you should see this," she said. Inside were folders related to previous estate discussions. Most contained duplicates of documents we already had. Then Olivia pulled out a thin envelope tucked between two binders. It had been overlooked for years. The envelope contained copies of emails exchanged among several family members shortly after my brother's health began declining. We sat together at the kitchen table and carefully reviewed them. Most were routine updates about appointments, finances, and legal paperwork. Then one message caught my attention. It referenced concerns about a transfer that had not yet occurred. The problem was the date. The email was written nearly 3 weeks before the transfer supposedly happened. I frowned and read it again. Then again. The language made no sense if the official timeline was accurate. Olivia noticed my expression immediately. "What is it?" she asked. I slid the page toward her. She studied it silently. "That should not be possible." I nodded slowly. For the first time, we were no longer dealing with assumptions. We had found a document that directly conflicted with the explanation presented during the family meeting. The contradiction was small, but it was real. Later that evening, my phone rang. It was Rachel. The call surprised me. We had barely spoken since the meeting. Her voice sounded pleasant enough. Calm. Friendly. Yet something underneath it felt strained. "Margaret, I heard you have been going through old estate records." I looked at the stack of folders beside me. "Yes." A brief silence followed. "I just hope nobody is getting confused by outdated paperwork." The comment immediately caught my attention. Not because of what she said, because of how quickly she said it. Almost as if she had anticipated the conversation. "The record seemed fairly clear to me," I replied. Another pause. Then she laughed softly. "Well, legal documents can be complicated." After we ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes. Rachel had not asked what we found. She had not asked whether we needed help. Her first concern was whether the paperwork might create confusion. The next morning, Olivia arrived before noon. I told her about the conversation. She listened carefully before opening her notebook. "Grandma, I think she is worried about one specific thing." I looked up. "What?" Olivia turned several pages and pointed toward the growing timeline she had assembled. Colored notes connected dates, emails, meetings, and transactions. In the center of the page sat the same transfer we had been investigating from the beginning. "Everything keeps leading back to this." I followed her finger. She was right. Every contradiction eventually circled back to the same event. The same missing explanation. The same piece of paperwork. Slowly, I realized we were getting closer to something important. And if Rachel was truly nervous, then perhaps she already knew exactly what that something was. The breakthrough arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Olivia and I had spent nearly 3 hours reviewing timelines when she suddenly stopped turning pages. Her eyes remained fixed on a single document near the bottom of the stack. "Grandma," she said quietly, "look at this." I moved closer. At first, I did not understand what had caught her attention. It was a routine authorization form connected to the transfer we had been investigating. Nothing about it seemed remarkable. Then Olivia pointed toward a signature date printed near the bottom of the page. I felt my stomach tighten immediately. The authorization had supposedly been approved nearly 2 weeks after the account it referenced had already been closed. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. We checked the dates again. Then we checked them a third time. The discrepancy remained. It was not an interpretation problem. It was not a misunderstanding. The timeline simply could not exist as written. I leaned back slowly in my chair. How did nobody notice this? Olivia gave a small laugh. Because nobody was looking. The answer felt painfully accurate. People tend to see what they expect to see. They trusted Rachel. Therefore, they trusted the paperwork she referenced. Very few bothered examining it themselves. Later that evening, I called Andrew again. He listened carefully while I explained what we found. This time his reaction was immediate. "Send me a copy." Within an hour, he called back. His voice sounded more serious than I had ever heard. "Margaret, There is another problem. My pulse quickened. What kind of problem? Papers shuffled in the background. The authorization form references a review meeting that never appears anywhere else in the estate records. I stared at the phone. Are you sure? Completely. He explained that every official meeting connected to the estate had corresponding notes, attendance records, or supporting documentation. Except this one. It existed only on the form itself. Nothing else supported it. When I ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes. The rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Across the table, Olivia organized the documents into neat piles. The evidence was beginning to tell a story of its own. Not a dramatic story. Not the kind shown in movies. A paper trail. Small inconsistencies. Missing records. Dates that refused to cooperate. The next morning brought another surprise. Eric stopped by unexpectedly. He looked tired. Concerned. He stood awkwardly in my doorway before finally stepping inside. We sat at the kitchen table where so many difficult conversations had happened recently. For a while, neither of us mentioned the estate. Then he sighed heavily. Rachel says you are digging through old paperwork again. I nodded. I am. He rubbed his forehead. Mom, this has become a major source of stress. I looked at him carefully. For whom? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, he said something that surprised me. I do not know anymore. It was the first truly honest thing I had heard from him in weeks. Before leaving, Eric glanced at the documents spread across the table. His eyes lingered on the timelines and notes. Do you really think something is wrong? He asked quietly. I considered the question. Then I slid the authorization form toward him. I think the documents are trying to tell us something. He looked down at the page. For the first time, he did not dismiss it. He did not laugh. He did not defend Rachel. He simply read. And as I watched his expression slowly change, I realized the most important shift had finally begun. Someone else was looking closely. After Eric left, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the empty chair across from me. For the first time since the family meeting, someone besides Olivia had actually looked at the documents instead of looking at me. The difference mattered. Facts had a strange power. They moved slowly, quietly, but once people truly saw them, they became difficult to ignore. The following morning, I woke to 3 missed calls from Eric. That alone was unusual. My son rarely called more than once unless something was genuinely important. When I finally reached him, his voice sounded unsettled. Mom, I spent half the night reading through those records. I remained silent. Some of the dates do not make sense. Hearing him say the words felt strangely emotional. Not because it proved I was right, because it proved he was finally asking questions. For years, Rachel's explanations had been enough. Now they were not. Eric continued. I asked Rachel about the authorization form. I sat up straighter. And a long pause followed. She said the paperwork was probably filed late. The answer sounded weak even through the phone. Eric clearly thought so too. Did she explain the missing meeting? I asked. Another silence. Then he sighed. No. After we hung up, I found myself standing in the kitchen staring out the window. Somewhere along the way, the conversation had changed. This was no longer about whether I was overreacting. It was about whether the records could be trusted. And once that question appeared, it became impossible to contain. That afternoon, Olivia arrived, carrying a folder full of organized notes. She looked almost excited. I think we finally found the pattern. We spread everything across the dining room table once again. Emails, timelines, authorizations, correspondence, property records. Olivia had highlighted every instance where dates conflicted with official documentation. Looking at them together, the pattern became obvious. None of the discrepancies existed in isolation. Each one connected to another. Every contradiction seemed to point toward the same cluster of decisions surrounding the estate. The paper trail was beginning to tell a story. Not a dramatic story. Not a criminal story. A story about information being presented in a way that encouraged certain conclusions while discouraging questions. Later that evening, Eric called again. This time he sounded different. More serious. Mom, I asked Rachel if she would be willing to review everything at the next family meeting. My pulse quickened slightly. What did she say? She does not think that is necessary. I looked down at the documents spread across the table. Olivia immediately noticed my expression. She said that? She asked after I repeated his answer. I nodded. Olivia leaned back slowly. If someone mocked me for asking questions, then refused to answer those same questions later, I would probably become suspicious. Her observation was simple, yet it perfectly captured what was happening. The next family meeting had already been scheduled for the following weekend. Originally, it was supposed to finalize several remaining estate matters. Now it felt like something else entirely. As the week progressed, tension quietly spread through the family. Relatives exchanged phone calls. Questions circulated. Nobody argued openly. Nobody accused anyone of wrongdoing. Yet the certainty that existed after the first meeting was gone. In its place stood something much more dangerous: doubt. On Friday evening, Olivia sent me a message containing a scanned copy of one final document she had found buried in old records. The moment I saw it, I felt my heart skip. The date on the page connected everything. Every discrepancy, every contradiction, every missing explanation. I stared at the screen for several long moments before finally looking up. Then I realized something that made me almost smile. If this document was genuine, nobody would need to believe me anymore. The paperwork could speak for itself. The family meeting began at 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. The setting was almost identical to the first gathering. The same living room, the same relatives, the same coffee cups resting on side tables. Yet the atmosphere felt completely different. During the previous meeting, people arrived confident. This time they arrived curious. Questions had spread through the family all week. Nobody said much about it directly, but the uncertainty was impossible to miss. As I entered the room, conversations softened briefly. Several relatives nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Rachel sat beside Eric on the couch. She smiled when I arrived, but the smile seemed smaller than usual, less effortless. Olivia took a seat beside me carrying a neatly organized folder. Across the room, I noticed several relatives watching it. The folder had become a character in the story all by itself. Everyone knew it contained something important. Nobody knew exactly what. The meeting started with routine estate business, property updates, financial summaries, legal deadlines. For nearly 30 minutes, everything proceeded normally. Then Eric cleared his throat. The room gradually quieted. "Before we finish," he said, "there is something we need to discuss." Nobody moved. Rachel remained perfectly still beside him. Eric glanced toward me, then toward Olivia. "Some questions have been raised about several estate records." The silence deepened. During the first meeting, people laughed when I tried to speak. Now nobody seemed interested in laughing. Olivia opened the folder and carefully removed several documents. One by one, she placed them on the coffee table. Not dramatically, not emotionally, methodically. Dates, authorizations, emails, meeting notes, timelines, facts, nothing more. Eric picked up the first document and began reading aloud. Then the second, then the third. The room listened. Nobody interrupted. Nobody rolled their eyes. Nobody made jokes. As the timeline unfolded, the contradictions became impossible to ignore. The authorization form referenced an account that had already been closed. The missing meeting appeared nowhere else in the official records. The emails discussed events before they supposedly happened. Every individual discrepancy seemed small. Together, they formed a pattern. I watched faces change around the room. Confusion replaced certainty. Curiosity replaced confidence. One cousin quietly reread a page 3 times before setting it back down. Another relative removed reading glasses and studied the dates more carefully. The transformation happened slowly, like a room waking up. Finally, one of my uncles spoke. "Wait a minute." He pointed toward one of the documents. "This timeline does not work." Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. The paperwork answered for us. Rachel sat motionless. Her hands remained folded in her lap. She did not argue. She did not interrupt. She simply watched as people reached conclusions on their own. The same people who had laughed a week earlier now leaned forward, studying the evidence with complete concentration. Then Eric read the final document, the one Olivia discovered the previous Friday. The page connected every inconsistency into a single timeline. When he finished reading, the room became completely silent. Not uncomfortable silence. Realization silence. The kind that arrives when people suddenly understand something they should have noticed much earlier. I looked around the room. Nobody was looking at me anymore. Nobody was looking at Rachel either. They were looking at the documents. The facts had become more important than personalities, more important than reputations, more important than assumptions. For years, people believed the most confident voice in the room. Now they were listening to paper. And paper never cared about popularity. For several long moments, nobody spoke. The documents remained spread across the coffee table like silent witnesses. The room that had laughed at me a week earlier now felt completely different. Nobody was looking for jokes anymore. Nobody seemed interested in dismissing concerns. They were too busy rereading dates, comparing timelines, and trying to understand how they had missed something so obvious. Finally, my uncle lowered the last page and exhaled slowly. Margaret was right. The sentence was not dramatic. It was not loud, yet it seemed to echo through the room. One by one, relatives looked toward me. Not with pity, not with amusement, with something I had not seen in a very long time. Respect. Across the room, Rachel remained silent. Her confidence had disappeared, replaced by a thoughtful expression that made her seem older somehow. Not defeated, just exhausted. For years, she had been the person everyone trusted automatically. Now the documents had forced people to trust something else. Facts. Eric sat quietly staring at the paperwork in front of him. Eventually, he turned toward Rachel. Why didn't you tell me about these inconsistencies? His voice was calm. That made it harder to listen to. Rachel looked down at her hands. Because I thought they were minor. Nobody responded immediately. The explanation felt insufficient even before anyone said so. Another relative spoke up. Minor or not, they should have been discussed. Others nodded. Not angrily. Simply honestly. The conversation that followed surprised me. Nobody attacked Rachel. Nobody accused her of malicious intentions. Instead, people asked questions. Real questions. The kind they should have asked from the beginning. How did this happen? Why were concerns dismissed so quickly? Why did everyone assume Margaret was confused instead of checking the records themselves? The answers were uncomfortable. Because the truth was not about one document, or one transfer, or one estate meeting. The truth was about how easily people accept the version of events presented by the most trusted voice in the room. Rachel eventually looked up. Her eyes met mine. I owe you an apology. The room became quiet again. I studied her face carefully. For the first time since all of this began, there was no performance there. No careful image management. No attempt to control the conversation. Just honesty. When you spoke up, I should have listened, she said softly. Instead, I assumed I already knew the answer. I nodded. There was nothing left to argue about. The documents had already settled the question. After a while, the meeting ended. Relatives gathered their belongings. Conversations continued quietly in small groups. Several people stopped to speak with me before leaving. Some apologized directly. Others admitted they never took the time to examine the records themselves. One cousin laughed awkwardly and shook his head. I cannot believe I made jokes before reading any of it. I smiled politely. What mattered was not that people had been wrong. What mattered was that they were willing to admit it. As the room gradually emptied, Eric walked me to my car. The afternoon sun hung low over the neighborhood. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he finally said what had clearly been weighing on him. Mom, I should have listened to you. I looked at my son and saw genuine regret in his eyes. Maybe, I replied. But now you are listening. He smiled faintly. We embraced before parting ways. The drive home felt peaceful. Not because I had won. Not because someone else had lost. The peace came from something simpler. I no longer needed to convince anyone. The truth had done its own work. A week earlier, people laughed when I spoke. They trusted personalities more than paperwork. They trusted assumptions more than evidence. Then they read the documents. And in the end, that changed everything. As I pulled into my driveway and stepped out beneath the evening sky, I realized the greatest victory was not being proven right. It was knowing that I never stopped telling the truth, even when nobody wanted to hear it.